I'm Jennifer Newell, and I'm a historian and I'm a curator as well at the American Museum of Natural History. Museums can help communities that have been displaced by climate change in lots of ways, and they're really wonderful sites for bringing people and objects and communities together in really very supportive ways. And I think one of the great things that museums can do is not only provide a sort of a safe space for people to think about connections to their heritage and connections to new places that they might have moved to, but also a safe place to sort of rethink things like identity and to hand on knowledge about their culture to other generations, to the next generation. Some of the really wonderful projects that we've had at the American Museum of Natural History have involved, I guess, objects as lodestones, sort of magnetic things that pull people in and bring in their stories and share their stories. We've had a really wonderful opportunity to work with Toi Hoati from the east coast of the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and they came to visit one of their ancestors, a living ancestor in our collections called Paikea, and he's a whale rider figure, and he was in our collection for a long time, and we didn't realise his significance, and so we were just it's a very, very special time that they had with him. They came in and visited him for a week, and we had a really very important and very enriching series of events over the course of a week, and that was the start of an ongoing relationship between the museum and Paikea, the ancestor object, and the community. So it's really valuable. The other really wonderful project we've had going for the past year has been with the Museum of Samoa, and the project is called Rethinking Home, Climate Change in New York and Samoa, and it's been bringing together two communities who are coastal communities to share personal insights into the impacts of climate change particularly on home and people's connection to home. And we're wanting people to be able to learn cross-culturally and to share their insights on web pages. We've got a web page, but also through a book and a video, and so we're coming together through different means to share these insights, and it's been a really valuable process.
I'm the Pacific curator at the American Museum of Natural History, and I'm particularly concerned in my research with the cultural impacts of climate change in the Pacific. I'm also investigating ways that the many museums that hold collections of the tangible heritage of Pacific peoples might become resources for well-being for those who are seeking to maintain cultural cohesion and ways to create new connections to place. Many of the features of museums that you might assume make them difficult for communities to access, their didacticism, their slow pace, actually fit them to work as supportive, contemplative spaces, where people can reflect and rework in a safe place thoughts about belonging, heritage, and stewardship of country. Continuing today's focus on caring for country in the context of the Anthropocene, I want to explore how people who are deeply connected to a particular place manage to uproot and effectively put down new roots, new connections of significance somewhere else. This type of movement that's going to become increasingly common away from this will become increasingly common away from places buffeted by cyclones and rising seas and droughts. Today I'm going to talk about the nexus of people and objects and the site of the museum, and how that nexus can support important connections to heritage and creative placemaking. The new relationships forged in this nexus tend to be transformative and sustaining for all participants, community members, and museum staff alike. Following on from James Clifford's concept of the museum as a contact zone, I see museums as powerful zones of exchange. These encounters are mutually transformative in exactly the ways that we need them to be. They are good for bringing out and sharing the stories that matter within our respective cultural worlds. It is, as Nicholas put it yesterday, the readiness to be altered by other ways of knowing, the learning beyond our cultural habits of mind, that give us new tools for resilience. And it's creative of the empathy that allows us to care for each other and care for country. As Libby highlighted, it is more care that we need and what we in the humanities have the capacity to foster. My key point, and the one that I think I share with my fellow panel members, is that museums are really good places for thinking across borders, especially thinking cross-culturally in safe, creative and contemplative spaces. John Campbell of Waikato University has estimated that by 2050, the number of Pacific Islanders displaced by climate change could be between 600,000 to 1.7 million. Atolls are being frequently overwashed. Their taro crops are dying from salt water bubbling up through the coral substrate. And on all islands across the Pacific, erosion, ocean acidification and coral bleaching is reducing sources of self-sufficient food production. Increasingly severe weather is destroying homes and threatening the resting places of ancestors. For cultures as deeply rooted to the lands, seas and sites of the ancestors as Pacific cultures are, contemplating leaving home is incredibly difficult, and for some it is not imaginable. As Phil pointed out yesterday in his introduction, in his acknowledgement of country, people are coming to terms with with futures as potential climate change refugees, or migrants to use the preferred less victim nuanced term. And in fact, there are communities that have already left, such as from Taku in the Carteret Islands near Papua New Guinea, and also a number of villages within Fiji. There are strong cultural traditions of voyaging and migration in the Pacific, but this is a new type of movement. In time, many of these migrants will be unable to practice the frequent returns home that characterise Pacific migrants today. Environmental challenges form one of the growing push factors driving migration out of the Pacific. In urban centres facing the Pacific, Auckland and Sydney and San Francisco, there are a variety of economic, educational and social pull factors. There's also the rather more unpredictable chain migrations, such as the flow was begun by John Moody in the 1980s, which has so far brought some 4,300 Marshall Islanders under the Compact of Free Association with the US to work in chicken factories in Springdale, Arkansas. Here's some girls from, these are Marshall Island girls, but in Arkansas. I think they're about to have a good night out. Deborah Bird-Rose has helped us this morning to understand the living subject of country and living with country. And Ian McCalman in The Reef explains that when he spoke with two men of the Garija Gangaji and Gurugulu Galanji clans, I hope I got that right, that he says country denoted for them not just a particular geographical environment, known and cared for in every detail, but a cultural space alive with stories, myths and memories. It furnished food, drink and shelter, as well as every sort of sustenance for the mind and spirit. Connection to spaces, to sacred spaces, to ancestral places in Pacific Islands could be seen to chime with aspects of Indigenous Australian connections to place, to relationships of living and caring for country. There are traditions across the Pacific of, as I said, of voyaging and migrating, which could contribute to those cultural resources to sort of support the potential for moving away from sacred places. Recently, the American Museum of Natural History, Jacqueline Lacey and I asked Pacific Islanders living in New York who were attending one of our Pacific Open House sessions, through a survey that we gave them, just how they feel they maintain cultural traditions away from their home islands. Many said it was things like getting together with other people from their home islands, preparing food from home, dancing, and as one Hawaiian young woman said, it's also taking off shoes at the door out of habit and not cutting my nails at night. It's a big series of habits and habits of mind. Not jaywalking feels like it sometimes. It is place and how we connect to it in the face of growing environmental challenges and the growing dislocation that we are exploring at the American Museum of Natural History at the moment. A project that Jackie and I have established with Lumepa at the Museum of Samoa is bringing two coastal communities together, one in New York and one in Samoa, to share insights into the personal impacts of climate change, particularly severe weather. Rethinking Home, Climate Change in New York and Samoa, is a year-long project funded by Museums Connect, which is a program of the US Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. So through workshops and like this one, and video conferences, Facebook and a blog and the final product of a book or a video, we are exploring connections to places of personal significance, particularly the land and the material structure of home, and how people manage when these things are damaged or gone. Some of the group lost their homes to Hurricane Sandy and to Cyclone Evan, and all are considering how increasing danger changes the way you think about home and impacts on the parts of personal and cultural identity that we bind up in houses. In New York, our group includes a number of members of the Pacific diaspora. All are considering how they create and maintain a connection to home when home has shifted. One of our participants, Kelly, has written about moving to New York to study. And I want to read to you several passages from her piece to help you see the sorts of insights and, frankly, the beauty that you can uncover when people are offered this space. So these are Kelly's words. The swerving traffic and the bright lights of New York City can sometimes be suffocating for a small island girl like myself. Moving from the island of Maui to the island of Manhattan for a college education, I had such a difficult time finding spaces where I can unwind and breathe. In my homeland, the crashing waves and the smell of a light, salty breeze in the air immediately calms me. I've tried smelling the Hudson River to see if it could be nostalgic, but I do not suggest it if you're hoping to find serenity. Luckily, I found two places in the city that helped me unwind and breathe. Cherry Walk at Riverside Park and the Battery Park Staten Island ferry area. In both places, the enormous buildings and blinding lights can't interfere with my view of the calm waters and my view of the sky. So then Kelly then talks about not being able to comprehend the effect that Sandy had on my places of solitude, peace and happiness, because the same waters that bring me peace of mind and happiness burst fear and terror in the hearts of New Yorkers. She goes on to make a key point, and I quote, "In the islands of Hawaii, I have been raised to be a steward of the land and its ocean. Elders, educators, and my culture have ingrained into me the Hawaiian proverb, 'We cannot own the land or the ocean. The land and the ocean own us.'" And I feel this is really important, and it made quite a big impact on me. And I really wanted to be able to have the capacity to ensure that this perspective of hers, this kind of countercultural perspective, could have the opportunity to touch other people, to help them actually just really stop and listen and contemplate it. And I think we do often have the capacity to do this in museums. There's the expectation from most of our visitors that this is a space to slow down, to stop tweeting, to stop and read and think a bit. So when a perspective such as Kelly's surfaces within my institution, which is a very American, very science-focused and dinosaur-besotted institution, I feel very fortunate that I do have some capacity to run with it. So my colleagues in several divisions within the museum were very open to our finding ways to bring this kind of insight to a broader audience, to encourage the many potential users of the museum's many offerings in exhibitions, education programs, and online to think differently about their relationship to the natural world. So far, we're still being very digital about it. We have Kelly's blog, amongst others, nestled into the anthropology webpage. I'm talking to our communications department about giving the blogs a higher profile within the museum's climate change page, which is like an online pin board on climate change, and it's currently quite sciencey, so I'm keen to bring a bit more of a human voice to that. And more excitingly, the multimedia team have suggested that they could create an animated interactive book, such as the one that was created for the Poison exhibit. And there's an actual 3D book in the exhibition itself, but for the online site for the Poison exhibition, they've got this sort of a version of it, which is a bit more clunky, but still quite nice. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to use this as a way of featuring some of our group members' stories, illustrated with some gently animated line drawings. I think this intimate medium fits well with stories that often involve talking about personal losses and thinking about the local instance of a global problem. And while it remains to be seen if the upcoming exhibition at the AMNH called Nature Unleashed will be comfortable in stepping away from just presenting the science of natural disaster in a similar way that the big picture was the focus for the climate change exhibit that they had in 2008 to 2009. There is some indication that some of the stories and perspectives offered by participants in Rethinking Home or other people around New York might be able to be included in the section on Hurricane Sandy within Nature Unleashed. And this would be a crucial factor, I keep pointing out to them, in helping our audiences to make some personal connection to the people who lived through those disasters and help them to see the bigger picture and to care. So, before I conclude, I just want to give you one other story from the museum, which centres on the way that objects can be lodestones, particularly magnetic things that pull people in and pull stories in and permit intergenerational and cross-cultural learning and creating potent opportunities for caring for community. So about this time last year, I received an email from Wayne Nata of Toihoiti, which is an arts organisation within a community on the east coast of the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that iwi is called Te Atanga Ahoati. And so Wayne Nata wanted to bring a group to come and meet one of their ancestors who was living in our storeroom. And here he is. This is Paikea. Kia ora, Paikea. I just want to introduce you to everyone here. Kia ora. This is from an 1880s meeting house. So it's you can see the gable figure there. It's from that meeting house. And what Wayne wanted to do was to create not just coming and visiting Paikea and then going home again, he wanted to create a whole week of performances within the museum in which they would be able to introduce Paikea to his neighbours in New York and to explain to the groups who would come into the museum, members of the general public, also some school groups, to sort of explain to them how Paikea fits into their conception of the world. It was a very generous sharing. And so that we arranged this and with our education department, and we arranged with our collections managers to have Paikea brought out from storage, placed on this little stand on wheels. And they spent the week explaining Paikea to us, performing about Paikea, dancing to Paikea. And they explained that in their iwi in Tolaga Bay, everyone there is born looking to Paikea and dancing to Paikea. And they danced to him here, and there was lots of audience participation, and Wayne would get members of the audience, he taught us haka, and he'd get members of the audience to learn the names of the ancestors, and so we'd start with Paikea at the top, that's me, top there being Paikea, and then we'd say Paikea had, the next ancestor, right down through, I think it was 14 generations, right down to Te Kania Takaro, who made the meeting house. Wayne helped us to sort of understand a bit more of their perception of history, of the living presence of ancestors in everyday life. The potency of ancestry is a central cord running through life, connecting people to the sea, the land, community, past, present and future, all intertwined. He helped us to see the value of bringing stories together around Paikea, their long-term story, and our much shorter one, which just dated from the time that the museum had brought the carving in 1907. And the visit helped members of Toihoiti to add another layer of their own to their connection to heritage and to place. As one of the young women there said, "Now my life makes sense." Wayne would like Paikea and all the components of the meeting house back in due course. The visit was riven with unspoken tensions between who had control over this object, the collections managers, the curator, the community, who could touch it and in what ways, who was able to decide when and where it would be at any one time. And I was always slightly on edge because I wasn't sure whether our collections manager was going to suddenly rush in and say, stop, get your hands off that. But he didn't, and it was great, and it was a really wonderful sharing of trust. And also there was a lot of joking and good grace on behalf of Toihoiti. They put up with all of our funny rules, and they Also, when they first brought Paikea out after all the waiata was sung and the greetings were made, Wayne switched back into English and said, "Right, who has a really big suitcase?" For the meantime, Wayne feels the component parts of the meeting house are still useful in their various museums in exotic locations. An opportunity for people in their small East Coast community in New Zealand to visit family, as it were, in Germany, London and New York. This was a very powerful experience of returning emplaced culture to an object, sharing it and having it create a valuable learning environment for a group of New Yorkers and for the young people who came up from New Zealand to the storerooms and to the spaces at the museum. And also it was a chance to create a valuable and sustaining relationship for Paikea's community, and this relationship will be ongoing. I should say there's also many other examples of museums working on projects that are reconnecting objects to communities and which are creating cultural rejuvenation and healing as a result. They're working much more on the model of cultural centres like the Vanuatu Cultural Centre, which is all about supporting and documenting custom. There's a very long-term program there in which they've trained a group of field workers who come in from the villages and get training at the centre and then head out again and record traditions. And then they're sent all the recordings and objects that they collect are documented and kept within the cultural centre. It's a constant process of working between communities and that central meeting place, that repository. And the cultural centre in Vanuatu also includes a standard museum display within it, but its remit is much larger. And Jackie and Lemepa and I were talking to Dion Pieter on Tuesday at the Australian Museum, and I was just delighted and thrilled to hear, really inspired to hear about all their programs they have, which with the Department of Juvenile Justice, working with young offenders and helping young Pacific men to think about their identity as warriors in a more positive way than is often happening now. And so they've got a really good program, their Pacific Youth, what have I said there? Resurrection. Thank you. I was thinking it doesn't talk about resurrection. It's reconnection, that's what it was. Reconnection project, which is a wide-ranging project but includes the work with young offenders. They're also doing pop-up museums, so a community will come in and choose some objects that they want to have in one of their own community spaces, and the museum provides them with cases and labels, and that will go out to the community for a week. They're also getting Tongan and Samoan and Maori artists who come in every week to draw and study the objects. So it's a really vibrant and very transformative set of programs, and that's all happening here in Sydney. Also, just a very final quick example, Laura Peers at the Pitt Rivers Museum has been working with the Blackfoot community, and I was just very pleased to hear from Deborah this morning about the Blackfoot community, people who are also working with poetry. But this is a community that's still dealing with the scars of colonial violence and dispossession, and one of the things that Laura Peers at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford did was to loan some ancestral quillwork shirts back to the community, the men's shirts, which were able to be there. They were being touched and spoken about, and people were talking about their knowledge of them and passing it on to the younger people, and they were actually worn in some ceremonies. And Piers talks about that in a recent article and says that the healing that occurred within that community through this coming together around the shirts was created through the social relationships that those shirts enabled, and that included social relationships with the ancestors that the people were able to have access to through the shirts. So, to conclude, museums are well placed to help communities manage some of the growing challenges of the Anthropocene. Institutions have been taking on greater roles of social responsibility. They are opening up access, they are allowing some shared control over objects, and permitting multiple voices into displays. Despite what we might expect, the traditional qualities of museums, their slow, reflective pace, their capacious collections, and the role they tend to be given as knowledge authorities, actually supports their capacity to engage in public engagements in the issue of climate change and connecting with community and cultural heritage. As the need grows, we can expect the number and complexity of relationships to grow surrounding objects, surrounding objects, replenishing, helping each other to see new ways of approaching the land and the sea around us, caring for the places and communities, whether old or new, that we can learn to belong to. Thank you.